everyone. We're back again to talk about another aspect of human enhancement. This time around, we got something a little bit different. We've got a critique of human enhancement, a bioconservative critique from Michael Sandel, who is a philosopher at Harvard. Now, Sandel, he's mainly a political philosopher, but he's done a lot of work in various areas of ethics over the years. And what you all have assigned as reading for this week is an article published in The Atlantic that summarizes a lot of the key ideas from this book, The Case Against Perfection, Ethics in the Age of Genetic Engineering. So it's a little bit older now. It's getting there. 2007. Sandel's arguments in this book loom really, really large in a lot of the background for these debates on human enhancement. He himself has largely stepped aside from these debates in the last 5 to 10 years. It's kind of like he had a lot to say in the mid-2000s, and he said it, and that just kind of where he left it. Maybe it could be because he started working on other projects, or it could be because his view hasn't changed. Who knows? But this book and the ideas in it really have shaped a lot of the contemporary discussion. So it's important to have some exposure to his ideas to understand some of the skepticism about human bioenhancement and related technologies. So let's put his work into some context and think about the broader debate. So whereas a lot of the stuff we've read so far has been focused on very specific enhancements, should we performance-enhancing drugs, should we legalize those? Should we legalize cognitive-enhancing drugs, and especially in universities? After we came back from spring break, the first thing was anti-aging medicine. Should we pursue the development of anti-aging medicine, and if so, how should we prioritize it relative to other things? This is different. This is a critique not of a specific human enhancement, but of the entire human enhancement project. So it's much broader in scope. This is one of the reasons why I saved this for the last 3-4 weeks of the class. It's because you got to have some exposure to these other enhancements, the nature of the debate in some other areas before you see this critique and get a sense of what Sandel's up to. So, first piece of background information. This is Sandel's work is clearly situated in what's more or less an ongoing debate between two very different outlooks on human enhancement. The first of these is transhumanism, which roughly, in a broad sense, is the philosophy that we should make efforts to enhance human beings beyond their biological limitations. So Nick Bostrom, who was one of the authors assigned for last week, he's a paradigmatic transhumanist. What we read from him was about anti-aging, but he's on the record supporting tons of other bioenhancements. So it's not just that. He just thinks, we should do whatever we can to make people's lives better. We should be interested in increasing human potential across the board. Age, intelligence, physical capability, whatever it is. Bostrom is generally on board with the Human Enhancement Project. The counter to this, the alternative perspective, the anti-Human Enhancement Project viewpoint, is bioconservatism. This, in a broad sense, is the philosophy that we should not pursue technological or biological enhancements that enable people to exceed their natural limitations. So here's a sense of where some of the authors that we've read in the class fall. Two clear transhumanists are Nick Bostrom and Julian Savulescu. Now Savulescu, we read some of his stuff on performance-enhancing drugs. He had a co-authored piece supporting their legalization and the legalization of those drugs in sports. Bostrom, we read his support of anti-aging. Savulescu, we will also read something from him next week about how we make procreative choices and how genetic engineering could help us, in a sense, create better children or children with a greater chances of a better future, that kind of thing. He interestingly not only thinks that that's something we should pursue, but thinks that parents would be obligated to create the best offspring that they possibly could, the offspring with the best chance at a good life. He thinks that, so in other words, you'd be obligated to genetically engineer your child to have the best chance of a good life. We'll leave that position for next week, but going to be interesting. On the bioconservative side, Sandel is the first author that we've read that I think is clearly in that camp. We will also read a work by Robert Sparrow, who is also clearly in the bioconservative camp. Most of the authors that we've read in this course don't neatly fit into being a transhumanist or being a bioconservative, because it's possible to have a mixed set of viewpoints. So you might be someone who thinks, well, cognitive enhancement seems like something that there's just no real good reason to oppose, but I have a lot of reservations about, say, performance-enhancing drugs or physical enhancement, because those introduce other issues. That's a coherent position. You could have a sort of mixed bag type view that's somewhere in the middle. And you also might just have a mixed view on a specific enhancement. You might think that, cognitive enhancing drugs in the abstract are worth pursuing, but universities should still make efforts to limit their use, because it would be, say, unfair. It would create inequities in the grading process or in measuring student abilities or something like that. So it's not as if everybody's going to be classified as a transhumanist or a bioconservative, but there are some people that seem to clearly fit in to these different categories. Now, there are two main types of bioconservatism. The first type is the in principle variant of it. So on this view, human enhancement is simply wrong in principle. The idea here is, even if you could do human enhancement in a perfect way, you could enhance every human being, you could avoid any kind of discrimination or undesirable health impacts, you could make it available to everybody regardless of economic status, etc. Solve all those injustice, related worries. Even if you could do that and implement it all perfectly, it would still be wrong, or it would still be objectionable. It would still be something we should oppose. The second type of bioconservatism is that human enhancement might be okay theoretically. There might be nothing wrong in the abstract with, say, letting someone pop a few pills to improve their memory retention or their cognition, or to take an extra hit of human growth hormone when they're younger so that they grow more and get a little bit taller. But in practice, when we actually try to make human enhancements available to everybody or to control for other kinds of injustices, it's not going to work. That's the second view. The second view is that human enhancement might be okay in theory, but it wouldn't work in practice. It would lead to unacceptable negative outcomes, whether it's in terms of decreases in welfare from unintended side effects, or more likely be as a result of creating injustice or inequity. Sandel's article on human enhancement is an in-principle critique. So it is this first camp. Sandel thinks that human enhancement, even if it could be done in ways that were fair, equitable, etc., would still be something we should oppose. Here's one representative quote where he uses several examples at the beginning of the article to illustrate some of his concerns about human enhancement. And one of the things that he talks about is muscle enhancement, another one is memory enhancement. And in both of these, he reaches the same conclusion. He says, as with muscles, so with memory, the fundamental question is not how to ensure equal access to enhancement, but whether we should aspire to it in the first place. So there are concerns, of course, with muscle enhancement and performance-enhancing drugs about ensuring that everyone has equal access. It's the same thing with memory enhancement. The same kind of concern can be raised with memory enhancement and cognitive enhancement. But Sandel's point is that's not the real question. The real question is, are these things that we should want in the first place? If the answer to that is yes, then we move on to the practical questions, right? To the questions about how we would do it in the real world. But he doesn't think we should aspire to it, so he never gets to those questions. Now, the way that this article proceeds, this article is the longest and most dense reading that we have on tap for the term. It's not because it's badly written. It's quite well written. It is accessible, even to someone without a deep background in the literature. But it's long, and Sandel doesn't waste his words. He's trying to summarize a 200-page book in about 8 to 10,000 words worth of an article. That's hard to do. So he's not wasting any words, which means that the ratio of word to argument is very, very high. Lots of arguments being put forth, being examined in this article in a relatively short amount of space. I'm not going to cover nearly all of the things in the reading. I'm just going to draw attention to the main highlights, the big picture takeaways. But the way that it's structured is that Sandel looks at a wide range of different arguments, and he rejects some of these as he goes along, and he proposes others that he thinks are better. So, for instance, he starts out by talking about concerns about fairness and equity with respect to certain kinds of enhancements. And he says, well, think about, do performance-enhancing drugs make sports less fair? Well, that's not really a good objection to performance-enhancing drugs, because sports have always been inherently unfair in a different way. Right, with respect to the genetic lottery or the natural lottery. Some people are taller, some people are more athletic, some people have, one of the examples from last semester, some people have more red blood cells, higher red blood cell count. So they're able to circulate oxygen to the muscles in their body faster than other people. There are all kinds of little advantages and disadvantages that way. So sports are already inherently unfair in that respect. So the idea that they're unfair because they have performance-enhancing drugs doesn't give us a reason. That doesn't give us any reason to oppose performance-enhancing drugs. It's not already present to oppose, the allowance of natural talents in sport. So he doesn't think that's a good objection. And that's just one of several that he rejects as the paper moves along. The ones that he keeps and the ones that he thinks are more decisive, those are the ones that we'll be focusing on in the time that remains. Now, I will give you fair warning here. You will have a short review quiz next week about some of the details in this article. Last semester, this was an article that I think, because of its length and complexity, a lot of people just didn't read it. And they did not do well on the exam where I tested them on this material because of that. So I'm going to make sure that doesn't happen. You will have a review quiz next week that's due, that probably just a series of true-false questions, but that you will not be able to just read this PowerPoint or listen to me talk about this stuff and ace that quiz. You will actually have to sit down and engage with this article to do well. So don't neglect that. But I also, at the same time, don't want us to lose sight of the forest for the trees here. I do want us to have a sense of the big picture perspective that Sandel's bringing to the table. Now, here's one critical clarification before I highlight the 4 arguments that Sandel makes. Sandel's definition of human enhancement means that we're only referring to enhancements or medical procedures that increase human abilities above normal biological limits. What that means is that when we use medical or technological procedures to help remedy illness or deficiencies or deformities or other kinds of losses that put people below normal human capacities, those are not cases of enhancement on Sandel's view, and he has no problem with them. If you're in a serious car accident and you have to have a leg amputated, and you get say a bionic leg or some other kind of prosthetic, he'd be totally fine with that. He sees no reason to oppose that. If you had some kind of really, really serious illness and we give you some kind of medication to essentially, help you fight the illness or make the illness go away, that would be totally fine. Sandel, I think, in principle, would not oppose, for instance, if we developed a remedy for Alzheimer's, something that prevented people from having that mental deterioration. He would not view that as cognitive enhancement. He would simply view that as a type of medical treatment. The reason I point this out is that when we say that Sandel is against the Human Enhancement Project, we need to be clear on what he means. He is not against using the technology we have to help people who are suffering or have suffered some kind of setback to their normal human capacities. He's not against any of that. He is only against enhancements that raise us above normal human biological limits. Okay, so what are his actual arguments? First argument that he makes in this essay makes it a couple of different places. Human enhancement is objectionable because it undermines our humility. Now, Sandel, not all of his arguments can be situated neatly in one of our ethical theories, but to the extent that he is making arguments that are dependent or fall into a background theory, virtue ethics is generally the closest in alignment. This one is an obvious virtue ethical argument because humility is a paradigmatic virtue. It's going to make all the lists, right? Having so, if you think about, we got to go back a ways to think about this, but if you go back a month and a half in time, when we were talking about these different theories, humility is right in between, two vices, just like all the others. There's the vice of excess, which is having too much humility. That's rarer, but that's the kind of person who doesn't seem to recognize the meaning or value in anything that they do. The person who is too self-deprecating, too modest. That's one vice. The other vice, the lack of humility, which is the more common vice, is sort of being overly prideful or having hubris. And Sandel thinks that human enhancement represents the deficiency of humility, the excess pride. If you're engaging in the Human Enhancement Project, then that's basically a way of saying that you no longer accept your faults. They can just, you view them as just things that can be surpassed. Sandel never uses this phrase, but this argument is the closest that he comes to making a kind of an argument like we shouldn't play God. That term obviously has a sort of religious connotation, or that phrase has a certain religious connotation, but you don't have to be religious to understand the basic philosophical point. The idea is there are certain things in the world that shouldn't be tampered with, and trying to tamper with them reveals a certain lack of appreciation for one's place in whether in the divine order or in just the cosmos in a secular sense. This idea is represented and expressed by people who are religious and people who are non-religious. Just depends on how you want to cash it out. This is kind of where Sandel is going with that argument, although I don't recall anywhere in the essay where he actually uses the phrase play God to describe it. The other thing that follows from this is that because we're assimilating all of these faults and flaws in these aspects of our place in the world into things we can control, we no longer sort of stand in awe of these kinds of things. We no longer have any instilled sense of humility about humanity or about our place in the world because there's not really a reason to be, right? We can just change it, or so the thought goes. Now, the way that virtue ethical arguments are designed to work is there's always this implicit idea that this perspective reveals some kind of vice about our character, something bad, something that we shouldn't want. So the idea here is we should want to be people who have humility. But if we're pursuing human enhancement, we won't have humility. It will either immediately or gradually over a long period of time be eroded and be eradicated. And I think here it's open to a person like Nick Bostrom to just say, well, your motivations for pursuing human enhancement could be far grander, far more respectable than this kind of person. A person pursuing human enhancement doesn't have to be portrayed as someone who's just overly prideful and controlling. It could be someone who just doesn't want to die. And in the case of like Bostrom's fable, someone who just wants to live longer because they don't like death. Or it could be someone who just wants to be a little less forgetful, wants memory enhancement because they want to be a little less forgetful. Or someone who wants certain types of physical enhancement because they want to realize, some kind of goal or some kind of potential that they don't think they can realize otherwise. Those goals are not obviously reflective of bad character or necessarily of a lack of humility. So as far as Sandel's arguments go, this one I think is one you can try to push back on. I think there are some places here where he's vulnerable. Now here's a different one. This one is not obviously, I don't know what theory, if any, this would fall into, but the argument is that human enhancement would lead to an explosion of responsibility. That's his phrase, explosion of responsibility. And the implication, this would be a very, very bad thing. Why would it be bad? Well, we all benefit in certain ways from not being personal. Things we all benefit from. All right, going to make a slight tweak. All right. That should be not now. So Sandel thinks we all benefit from not being fully responsible for who we are. So we are constantly shielded from being responsible for a variety of factors about ourselves that we couldn't control, things that are generally considered fixed at birth. So things like our height, our eye color, our nationality, our natural athleticism or hand-eye coordination. The list could go on. So he gives an example, for instance, if you were on a basketball team and you failed to get a rebound, it would be perfectly appropriate for your coach to criticize you for not being in proper position, not boxing out your opponent properly so you could be in position to grab the rebound. But your coach could not criticize you for not being taller. That would seem out of place because that's not something that is within your realm of control. But what if it was within your control? What if those things could be changed? What if you could take an enhancement that would make you taller or stronger or faster or whatever? Now, it seems like we, in some sense, become responsible for some of those things. And that means it seems like we could be criticized for those kinds of things. So now your coach could criticize you for not being tall. I mean, not in that direct sort of way, but they might say, this is what happened. Billy, this is what happens when you're not taking your human growth hormone pills. You get short, and then the opponents out-rebound you. And sit on the bench. I don't know how good of a coach voice that is, but whatever. You get the idea. That's just one context. There could be plenty of other contexts where other things might be relevant. So imagine being criticized for not taking a cognitive enhancement, doing poorly on a test or something, and being criticized for not taking a cognitive enhancement. It would seem reasonable to be critical of someone who, say, just didn't study at all, blew off their responsibilities and didn't study at all. Not appropriate to criticize them for not taking a cognitively enhancing drug. But in the enhancement-prone world, maybe they would be criticizable for that. Sandel thinks this would be a really bad thing because now what we are responsible for and what we can be criticized for suddenly has exploded. It's expanded dramatically. And that would create a lot of problems for how we live, because now the locus of our sort of personal responsibility has expanded so radically that it would make us we would be potentially blameworthy for so many more things that it would just be hard to know how we should act or what we should do under such circumstances. This is an interesting objection from my point of view, mainly because I have never seen anyone else in the enhancement literature anywhere bring this up, and I'm honestly not sure totally what to make of it. I think that he's right that it would change our concept of what was in our control and what we were responsible for, but I'm not sure what the consequences of that would be socially, because we would adjust over time. We would adjust socially to that, and I don't know what that world would look like. Sandel thinks it would be worse. Maybe you think so as well. I'm just not sure. Here's another interesting argument that he makes. He thinks human enhancement erodes moral solidarity. Now, what does that mean? Well, the basic idea is that he thinks human enhancement would discourage us from banding together in close-knit communities. Now, that is, in the abstract, that's not obvious how he gets to that. So here are a couple of the key steps in that argument. Part of what makes people form communities is some kind of shared recognition that everybody's flawed and everybody needs the help of other people to make their lives worthwhile. So we all have vulnerabilities. And the reason why we look out for the people who are the least advantaged is that we recognize if certain circumstances were just a little bit different, we might be in that least advantaged category ourselves. So we want to guard against that. We want to have a sort of social safety net so that we don't fall into those. So that if the chips are down for us, we've got some way to make ends meet and to not be just SOL. The problem is, human enhancements would give us a method of correcting a lot of our personal shortcomings, of just enhancing ourselves to the point where we're no longer worried about being part of that least advantaged group. And that would make it less necessary for us to form cohesive social groups or care about the plights of those who are worse off than us. Because, in other words, it would encourage a type of personal independence that Sandel thinks would be very bad. It would ultimately lead in a large scale, it makes society worse because we'd be less close knit and we would be more socially isolated. Much like the previous argument, I'm not totally sure what to make of this line of reasoning. I agree to an enhancement-prone society where there's a big emphasis on individual autonomy. It is very true that a lot of people would probably be looking to take enhancements to correct their personal shortcomings. Would that lead to different kinds of communities, and would that overall picture be worse overall than what we currently have? I don't know. It's interesting because we've already seen one thing since Sandel wrote this article. We've already seen one thing that eroded some of this solidarity, even though we don't think about it as much, and that was essentially the advent of social media on the internet. There's a lot of research that essentially people have substituted these kind of superficial digital relationships for in-person relationships, and psychologically that's, I think in general, been a bad thing. People's subjective well-being seems to go down. It goes down. It correlates negatively with social media use and other things. There might be, now correlation doesn't imply causation, so there's more to be said there. There's a deeper story there. But I think one of the takeaways is that if we become more socially isolated, as in less in-person contact and less deep friendships and close personal relationships overall, that's generally a bad thing. That generally makes people worse off. So if that were to happen, that's at least some evidence that maybe things in one dimension would be worse. Would it be worse overall, all things considered? Because again, there would be a trade-off here. There would be more personal autonomy. You'd have the ability to, again, correct some of your personal shortcomings. I don't know. I'm not totally sure how this argument ultimately would shake out. Now, the last one is the one that I've seen discussed the most in the literature. This is probably the closest thing that Sandel's book has to a signature argument, at least as far as what's left its mark in the ongoing discussions about human enhancement. So the argument is that human enhancement would be bad because it would eliminate our appreciation for natural gifts or talents or endowments, whatever you want to call them. Now, what I'm reminded of here is a quote from the movie The Incredibles from Dash, who he's unhappy that he essentially can't go out for sports because he's a superhero in that movie. And this, of course, he's got super speed, so he would, be able to run the 100-yard dash in 0.5 seconds, and he'd win. But it would look bad. in certain ways. So his parents don't let him go out for sports. And at one point, his mother says to him, everybody's special, Dash. And he says, that's just another way of saying no one is. Because, of course, the whole notion of having some kind of special gift or talent becomes meaningless if anybody can acquire that gift or talent. And that's exactly the kind of worry that Sandel has in mind. The concern is, if anyone can have great hand-eye coordination, or excellent height, or physical endurance, or a high red blood cell count, or whatever it is, and a great memory, if anybody can have those kinds of things, then they become less valuable because they're no longer unique. They're no longer special in the relevant way. Sandel thinks this would be a huge loss for humanity. It would be a very, very bad thing if these great, natural gifts or talents were suddenly commonplace. That we would lose a lot of their value, and in a related way, he thinks we would see it as less valuable to cultivate those talents, right? So I'll just take one recent, one example from a sport I follow. LeBron James is one of the most, as his physical build, his strength, his agility, his combination of athletic attributes is truly extraordinary, and so there's something special about seeing an athlete like that cultivate those talents and develop those abilities, right? But if everybody could just take a certain set of supplements to get a body like LeBron James and to play basketball that way, they're probably, they still have to do tons and tons and tons of training and just be good. It's not like it's just the physical body that makes the difference there. But if you could get that kind of physical ability, essentially through enhancement, or perhaps a combination of enhancement or training, if it wasn't all that rare anymore, I think we would appreciate LeBron James as a basketball player and as one of the world's greatest athletes a lot less. I think the same is true for almost any great athlete, or for that matter, any great mind. If everybody with enough cognitive enhancement could become Stephen Hawking, would we value Stephen Hawking as much as we do? I don't think we would. I think our appreciation for that extraordinary intelligence would go down. So Sandel thinks that kind of world, a world where these natural gifts and talents are no longer valued, is a worse world than the world that we currently have. That we have, if we get into that world, we have lost something that is essential to the human experience. We have commodified an aspect of human experience that should be special and unique. So, before we go on to that, one last point on this. This to me is a really fascinating argument because it gets at, some people have a completely opposite perspective of Sandel on this. Some people think that natural gifts and talents are, they're just a result of essentially genetic lottery, and perhaps some combination of genetic lottery and maybe your background environment. But they aren't things in any case that you can control. And because of that, a lot of people think they don't really have a lot of value in themselves, and that the ability for people to have greater autonomy and greater control over their lives would be better. It would be a better alternative. But Sandel explicitly rejects that kind of perspective. He thinks these natural gifts and talents are outside of our ability to control. That's true. But that's part of what makes them so precious and so valuable and so essential to what it means to be human. Like, the whole notion of being human for Sandel seems to involve some aspect of being flawed as a person or being talented as a person. We all have a different set of strengths and weaknesses, right? None of us have max stats in the video game of life. We've all got, our attributes distributed a little bit differently. some of you are built where you got, like 9 charisma, but only 3 strength. Some of you have 7 strength, but only 4 intelligence. Some people got 8 intelligence, but only, 3 agility. The list goes on. But Sandel sees it as a central aspect of being human that we don't just have max stats, that we have certain strengths and weaknesses, and that a big part of our lives is spent around figuring out how to use the talents that we have to make it in the world. And if we take that away, if we just allow everybody to enhance themselves however they want, yes, we gain something in terms of personal autonomy, but we lose a lot more in terms of the meaningful sort of life-crafting experiences that get thrown by the wayside. Or at least that's how I understand the idea that he's getting at. It's a fascinating question, what our outlook on these natural gifts and talents should be. But Sandel thinks they're really, really valuable, and we shouldn't want to give those up, even for this increase in autonomy. And this last quote is sort of an encapsulation. These are the last couple sentences in the entire essay. And this is where he sort of encapsulates one of his main conclusions, which is, we shouldn't pursue a world where human enhancement is commonplace. So here's the last quote. He prefaces it by making some comments about what people believe the sort of origin of genetic engineering is. And he says, it's more plausible to view genetic engineering as the ultimate expression of our resolve to see ourselves astride the world, the masters of our nature. But that promise of mastery is flawed. It threatens to banish our appreciation of life as a gift, and to leave us with nothing to affirm or behold outside our own will. So, in other words, yeah, we'd have more autonomy, but all these aspects of life that we cherish and that we really value are sacrificed on the throne of personal autonomy. Is that really the world we want to live in? And Sandel thinks the answer is no. I don't honestly know whether he's right about that. I think that this is a tough question. Sandel's viewpoint is one general outlook, but I don't know. I'm not sure if the world that he envisions would actually be as bad as he says. So in a handout that I put up on Carmen, zoom in on this a little bit, there we go. I included at the end here a few notes about how you might challenge Sandel's overall positions. This doesn't go into nearly as much depth as as this little PowerPoint does, but it's got some of the same ideas. But I included here, what would be some strategies for challenging Sandel's overall view? So real quick, I'll just sort of highlight those. One is, you could disagree with some of the claims he makes about non-medical human enhancements. So suppose we were talking about the erosion of moral solidarity. You might just deny that. You might just say, I don't think human enhancement would erode our moral solidarity, or at least it wouldn't do so any more than a variety of other things that we already accept. So that would be one strategy, just deny that some of these negative effects would come about. Another strategy would be to say, well, the effects might come about, but they'd be out, they wouldn't be nearly as bad as Sandel is suggesting. So let's take a different argument. Number 2. So when we talk about the explosion of responsibility, sure, you might be responsible for more things than you were before because more stuff is under your control. That seems like a fair point. But at the same time, you might say, yeah, but we'd also kind of recognize that changing your biological sex, for example, would be really, really onerous, really burdensome. So we might say, well, even if human enhancement advanced to the point where you could alter something like that, people wouldn't be obligated to do it, and you wouldn't be held responsible for how you're born. And that same explanation might hold true for lots of other things. So you could say, this might happen to some degree, but there would probably also be an extent to which socially we still recognize that the way you're born is kind of your default formation, and you're not gonna you're gonna be very unlikely to deviate from that because the costs of doing so are high, even if the enhancement based means to do so are widely available. So we've got deny that the effects occur, deny that they would be as bad as he's suggesting, or you could agree with everything he said in the article. You could say all of these, things that you're talking about, losing the appreciation for natural talents and gifts, cultivating, kind of excessive pride and losing humility. You might say, you know what? All of those things would probably happen. I agree. But you know what? It would still be worth it, because the benefits that would come about from some of these enhancements would be absolutely enormous. The benefits of living in a society where everyone could potentially be hyper intelligent would radically outweigh any value that was lost along the way. The increase in personal autonomy tied to being able to essentially craft the type of person that you want to be, that would radically outweigh any negative associated with like the erosion of social solidarity or something like that. Now, this strategy would be very consequentialist in nature, right? Because if you're making this kind of argument, you're basically saying what really matters is the overall outcome. And so all we're really doing here is weighing the costs and benefits, and I think the benefits outweigh the costs. Sandel, I suspect, would not endorse that framework for approaching the question, because I don't think he's in any sense a consequentialist. His work in political philosophy and other areas of ethics suggests to me that he's probably closer to being a deontologist than anything else at the end of the day. But in any case, I'm skeptical that he would endorse this kind of consequentialist reasoning. So if you're not prone to just evaluating things as a consequentialist, that explanation may not appeal to you so much. But it's there. It's an option for how you could try to respond to Sandel and push back against his position. So this is a really thought-provoking article. There is tons of stuff in here. Obviously, like I said, he took this entire book and basically tried to condense it down at its core to a 8,000 or 9,000 word article in the Atlantic. Give it a look. Check out some of the other resources on Sandel and on transhumanism that I've put up, and make sure you complete the 2 exercises over the reading before the week is up. That's it for this one. I will catch you next time.